My name is Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani, and I am running to make the city affordable.
Zohran Mamdani has been in the news a lot lately, right? And for good reason. The 32-year-old socialist just won the New York City mayoral Democratic primary. And in many ways, he's new to the political scene, he's fresh, something different. He's a foreign-born socialist Muslim candidate in the largest city in the US, the most important capital of capitalism in the world. The media have predictably started coming after him. They've lost their shit.
Infidel,
Yeah.
infidel, but he did say that he wouldn't condemn it.
We've been seeing a lot of unhinged reactions from different corners of the corporate media.
When you have socialists in the Democratic Party, I don't know how anybody could argue that that would be beneficial for the party or...
But how about the rich?
No,
They get shot?
No, yes, they get taken
Are we
away.
kulaks?
Yes, they
It's
get
just
taken away.
But there's something people didn't pay enough of an attention to on the night of Zohran's
In the
victory.
words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done.
Why does an Indian Muslim born in Uganda with a middle name Kwame, why is this guy quoting Nelson Mandela in an acceptance speech? Zohran's identity and background are closely linked to his politics, and in this case, likely informs his decision to be a socialist. Socialism attempts to address the self-determination of people, solidarity, fighting against imperialism, and dignity for the poor and working class. These are important issues to Pan-Africanists and the independent struggle of Africa. In this video, we're going to explore how British colonialism, the African independence struggle, and Idi Amin's expulsion of Asians probably informs Zohran's politics more than many people are noticing. His life story explains why an Indian Muslim born in Uganda is named Kwame after Kwame Nkrumah and is quoting Nelson Mandela in his victory speech in the New York City Democratic mayoral primary.
Inshallah on the front page. Here are a few of my humble suggestions for headlines. MIA, Mamdani in Africa.
Let's get into the video.
Uganda.
What a lot of people don't realize is that India and Africa have over 3,000 years of cultural and commercial relations across the Indian Ocean. But in the 19th century, everything changed when the British Empire got involved. And of course it did. It has been a complicated history, but there are some uncomfortable truths. Indian merchants were key players in financing the Arab-led East African slave trade. This trade mostly stayed in the coastal areas like Mombasa and Zanzibar until 1884, when the Kingdom of Buganda became a British protectorate. That's when Indians started moving into the interior of what would later become modern-day Uganda.
The Asians have been in East Africa for well over 100 years. In the early 19th century, the British encouraged Indian merchants to set up business on the East Coast, seeing it as a way of extending British influence in the territory.
During the first wave, traders established shops called dockers, financed by Indian merchants like Alidini Vishram, who had prospered in the Zanzibar and Mombasa trade. These commercial networks extended deep into the interior, reaching Uganda and Eastern Congo, and they were actively encouraged by the British. The second wave came in around 1895. The British recruited 35,000 Indian labourers, primarily Punjabi, to construct the Ugandan railway. Many were indentured servants coming into a strange land to do backbreaking work under uniquely dangerous conditions. Famously, 135 Indians were attacked and killed by a pair of lions in Tsavo, Kenya during the construction. The British even made movies celebrating the white officers who killed these man-eating lions. A classic white savior nonsense. But it doesn't seem like they actually mourned too deeply the Indian workers who just died building a railway for them. Upon completion in 1901, approximately 7,000 labourers remained in British East Africa, joined by Gujarati traders who had come to serve the growing population. In the third wave, Indians were brought in to staff the British colonial administration. But here's the key fact. Colonial practices excluded Indians from senior government positions as well as agriculture.
Gradually, the Asians began to enter the professions and to fill the middle ranks of the civil service. The Asians had great economic power, controlling commerce and forming the only real middle class.
Uganda became a segregated society with Africans at the bottom, whites at the top, and Indians essentially running the colony on behalf of the British.
Until now, the Asian community, 80,000 out of a population of 10 million, has controlled Uganda's economy. They own nearly all the large shops and businesses. They do all the importing and exporting. They own the factories. They man the skilled posts. They're the doctors, the clerks, the accountants. In the 70 years since Britain brought them into East Africa, they've managed, quite simply, to take over the economy of Uganda. It is the Asians who have the large cars. The Africans drive jalopies, go by bus or on foot.
They enjoyed a privileged standard of living by global measures, but their status came at the expense of Africans who owned the land. Unlike Kenya, seen as a white man's country, and Tanganyika, seen as too poor, Uganda provided the best prospects for Asian advancement in Africa. According to Mahmood Mamdani, Zohran's dad, who we're going to get back to, if you were an Asian looking to build a future, Uganda was your best bet. The racially segregated education system favored Europeans and Asians over Africans, as it provided them with better funded schools and more resources.
In the poorer, mixed areas of Kampala, the Asians, small shopkeepers and businessmen, are always richer than the Africans. This man is typical of thousands of Asians in Uganda. His business employs 4 Africans and provides him with a comfortable income. Allows him to employ a houseboy, an African. The Africans are the servants in every Asian household.
Black Ugandans were systemically hindered from practicing business by the British, limited to subsistence agriculture and petty trade. By the time of Ugandan independence in 1962, Indians controlled 90% of the Ugandan economy, possessing the capital and networks to purchase British businesses as the colonizers departed, which further entrenched their position in society and gave them even more control of the economy. When discussing the expulsion of Indians from East Africa, there's a tendency to focus solely on Idi Amin. This often leaves out the complicity of the British Empire and Indians themselves for that matter. Here's what the victim narrative often leaves out. Indians tended to stick in enclaves and were not seen as integrated into wider Ugandan society. There was no real sense of solidarity and they played no significant role in the Ugandan struggle for independence. They were a closed-off community who barely interacted with blacks outside of a master-subordinate relationship in a work context. Many held racist attitudes. They could somehow see how whites discriminated against them, but never how they discriminated against Africans. I'm looking at Uganda. At its peak in the 1960s, Uganda had an Asian population of 80 to 100,000 people, and at least 50,000 of those held British passports by 1962 when Uganda gained independence.
80,000 Asians will have to leave, and the great majority of them, at least 50,000, are holders of British passports. These are the people who were given a choice of citizenship when Uganda became independent in 1962 and who chose to remain British.
This decision further alienated the community from Ugandan society. Enter Idi Amin. Uganda gained independence in 1962 with Mutesa II as president and Milton Obote as prime minister. Obote eventually fell out with Mutesa and overthrew him in a coup, establishing himself as a dictator. Despite the political instability, it was business as usual for the Indian elites. Everything changed in 1971 when Idi Amin took power, overthrowing Milton Obote. The situation in the country became more tense for Indians as the new leader was more open about his feelings towards the community. Mahmood Mamdani describes a conference held between Amin and Asian leaders just months before the expulsion.
Amin opened the first conference with a list of Indian shortcomings: social exclusion, a business culture rife with deception and lies, self-justifying racism that justified petty privileges colonialism conferred on them. He then went on to invite the same leaders to reflect as a community on the way forward, which these leaders, so-called leaders, refused to do at a critical juncture in the history of both the country and the Asian minority. This was akin to abdicating responsibility.
By 1972, Idi Amin issued his order expelling all South Asians. Amin attempted to justify the expulsion to the international media with his characteristically humorous but terrifying nature.
The Uganda is still not yet independent. Uganda will be independent after this, my decision, after I want to see that the whole Kampala street is not full of Indians. It must be proper black and administration in those shops is run by the Ugandans.
Would you like to get all Asians out, really, sir?
Yes, they must go to their country.
Even nationals of Uganda?
If they want to go, they are welcome to go.
What prompted some people, if they don't go by the time limit?
I think they will be sitting like they are sitting on the fire. I will tell you this. You just wait after 3 months.
What will you do to them?
Okay, you will see.
You said you wanted Uganda.
I think they will not sit comfortable here in Uganda. I will tell you this. I must actually tell you the truth.
You can only imagine the terror Indians felt, hearing the leader of a country they call home talking about them in such a threatening manner. They flocked to the British embassy, and many made plans to leave the country before the 3-month deadline the government had given them. A significant portion moved to the UK, others to Canada, Australia, and the US. Some moved back to India. The expulsion was widely condemned around the world, especially by the British government, who severed diplomatic ties with Uganda but lacked the self-awareness to acknowledge their own part in creating this unique situation. Contrary to the propaganda the British media especially has spread about this case over the last few decades, there was no large-scale loss of life in 1972. In fact, none of the sporadic massacres that happened in Uganda since Indians arrived involved Ugandan Asians.
We left and our employees lost their valuable employment, but a lot of Ugandans, intelligentsia, were actually eliminated by Amin. I mean, we tend to forget, we talk of the Asian expulsion, but a lot of Ugandans suffered. Over 500,000 Ugandans were actually completely eliminated, which was a very sad time for this country.
They didn't suffer much robbery or looting. The expulsion itself was a grand, well-organized act of theft that left little room for petty pilferers. And this isn't my opinion. This is according to Mahmood Mamdani himself, a man who was expelled as a young man from Uganda.
As a people, we were not chroniclers. We were also not given to reflecting on our own experiences critically. It is the children of refugees, second generation, who have attempted to address this deficit. These hand-me-down stories have gradually homogenized into victim narratives. But Uganda Asians are a poor fit as victims.
Contrary to popular belief, despite Amin's attempt to limit the assets the South Asian community could take out of Uganda, many still found a way to successfully move wealth out of the country. Dr. Samwiri Lemwanga Luyungo, professor of history at Makerere University in Uganda, explained the situation.
I read the Turn of the Tide. That's a very interesting book. They show you how the money was being taken, how they were taking the money to Bermuda and other places. And then, from that money, building all over the world. In India, they set up factories in India, especially in Gujarat. Even in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, Manuban set up a container factory there.
Post-independence Uganda and Kenya were blatantly immoral in expelling Indians under short notice. You can credibly argue it amounted to ethnic cleansing. But this conversation is usually had in a disingenuous way, without context as to why this policy was actually popular among the population. Uganda was created with the foundation of the British Protectorate, structured on economic apartheid in favor of the white British. Indians effectively took their place when the British left. A few years of independence had not done anything to change that. This was a structural problem. Idi Amin was a raving lunatic and an uneducated military officer who wasn't equipped to handle this challenge equitably without tanking the economy.
I am not a person who is afraid of being assassinated because I believe in God. and I know exactly when and how I will die.
But is it true that you said Hitler didn't kill enough Jews during the war?
Explaining away Indian expulsion as just racism or Amin being a monster or black supremacist is reductive and extremely dishonest. Amin was a tyrant who committed the overwhelming majority of his atrocities against black native Ugandans. Today, less than 1% of Uganda's population is Indian, but they still control the economy and remain even less integrated into Ugandan society. The difference now is offshore banking and support from the current Ugandan dictator Museveni. Now they can move their money more easily in and out of Uganda. For many who were expelled, this was an opportunity. As British nationals, the expulsion provided a chance to move to the UK and Canada for better economic opportunities. Many were happy to take this opportunity, and by and large, these people have thrived in the West. British colonialism in East Africa created political figures we see today. Priti Patel in the UK, Kash Patel in the US, Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak. These people came from a merchant or administrative class that was the only real middle class in the poor Uganda. Ugandan Asians were seen as indifferent to the plight of black Ugandans. Even till this day, some of that population still talk down on Africa in very recognizably racist tones and even romanticize the colonial period. This is quite similar to how white South Africans romanticize a period in Africa where black people had less rights and freedoms. They often attribute their success to hard work, intelligence, and diligence, but hardly acknowledge the fact that their success was only possible because British Uganda excluded blacks from participating in the economy. Even in Uganda, after independence, these East African Indians were seen as British loyalists, and many ultimately were. These people were equipped with all the tools to succeed in Britain, including the conservative ideology underlined not just by their Indian culture, but by their role in the protectorate of Uganda. Many essentially established the same kind of businesses they had in Uganda, in the UK and Canada. These were convenience stores, tailoring shops, textiles, even finance, manufacturing, leveraging strong community networks developed during the colonial era. All you have to do is look down any YouTube comment section on videos on this topic, probably including this one, and you will find Indians saying they were grateful for the expulsion because this expulsion allowed them to have the better lives they currently enjoy in Western countries. These events shaped Mahmood Mamdani, raised in Kampala. Unlike the stereotype of Indians in East Africa, he identified as an African of Asian origin. He was 16 when the country got independence, old enough to witness the birth of the new Uganda. The African-wide struggle for independence resonated with him, and he genuinely believed the promise of leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Martin Luther King. He was one of 23 Ugandan students in the 1963 Kennedy Airlift, which was a US-funded scholarship program that brought hundreds of East Africans to universities in the United States and Canada. He studied political science at the University of Pittsburgh. During his studies, he was among the many students who made the bus journey south to Montgomery, Alabama in March 1965 to participate in the civil rights movement. During the march, he ended up getting jailed. A brave move for a brown foreign student at the time. He made the connection between the independence movements in Africa and the civil rights struggle in the US. He recognized this was a joint struggle against the same enemy. This experience was quite transformative to his worldview. He started learning more about Karl Marx and other leftist ideas. His time in the US had a profound impact on him, inspiring him to return home to make a difference. Armed with a master's degree and a PhD, he headed back to Kampala in 1972 and got a teaching position at Makerere University. Unfortunately for Mamdani, he arrived just months before Idi Amin gave the order to expel Asians from Uganda. Like many other Asians, he had to flee the country later that year, and he spent some time in a refugee camp in England. Even in exile, he remained active in the struggle to depose Amin. The dictator was eventually replaced by none other than Milton Obote himself in his second spell as president. Even after Amin was overthrown, he continued being a vocal anti-government critic and was stripped of his Ugandan citizenship for criticizing the Obote government. This left him stateless for a while, so you can see a pattern here. It's clear here that Mahmood Mamdani, to an extent, was willing to accept the consequences of his political stance. Despite these challenges, Mahmood's scholarship was evolving with clear influence from Pan-Africanism and post-colonial theory. He hadn't just studied this, he'd lived this as a non-black African in an era where East African states were going through an Africanization process. This couldn't have been easy in a society where he would have been seen as privileged and out of touch with the black African plight. He still has some blind spots, and Mahmood has acknowledged this in his work. He remains a vocal critic of his own community. He took up teaching positions in South Africa, Tanzania, and the US in the 1970s, before our friendly, brutal dictator Milton Obote was overthrown by the military yet again. He moved back to Kampala in 1985, and by 1991, he was married to Miranai. That's Zohran's mom, by the way. Zohran was born later that year. A few years later, he took a position as Chair of African Studies at the University of Cape Town, moving to the newly independent South Africa in 1996 with his family. He was essentially driven out by white faculty members who couldn't handle his attempts to change a Eurocentric curriculum and his rethinking of South African identity as an African country. He went on to Columbia and wrote an essay titled "Is African Studies at UCT a New Home for Bantu Education?" That's a pretty base title, and that statement would have been quite provocative at the time. But the more you research into Mahmood Mamdani, he's not someone who's trying to make white liberals comfortable. His experience in post-apartheid South Africa definitely left an impression on him. This is visible in his books written during that period. South Africa promised a multiracial democracy with equality for all racial groups. This is unlike Uganda, where the racial minority made up an insignificant part of the population. In South Africa, there was more emphasis and a need for all racial groups to work together for the sake of the country. He saw the contradictions of South African society and recognized the familiar feeling of being in the colonial buffer zone as an Indian, somewhere in between, not white, not black. The difference is that in South Africa, Indians seem to have more of a stake in the country, proudly South African in many cases, even though they controlled less of the economy compared to Uganda. Many Indians joined the ANC in the anti-apartheid struggle, and they were more harshly discriminated against in South Africa compared to East Africa. There was a stark difference in the Indian experience. In Mamdani's critique of South Africa, he noted that the post-apartheid government was minimizing the importance of addressing material harm to celebrate symbolic reconciliation. He noted the material failure that allowed those who got rich off apartheid to keep their wealth as long as they apologized. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't focus enough on tracking down the beneficiaries of the apartheid violence. Mahmood Mamdani has become one of the major public intellectuals to emerge from the African continent in the past decades. He's part of an older post-colonial tradition that follows the likes of Walter Rodney, Samia Mere, Michael Manley, and Kwame Nkrumah. These famous leaders saw political freedom for the global majority as hollow without economic justice. To understand why many of these men shunned capitalism and liberal democracy and embraced socialist and Marxist ideas, just look at it this way. If non-Western nations are to accept the concept of a nation state, which in itself is a Western concept, a Marxist analysis is probably the most useful way for people of color and the global South majority to fight against Western imperialism and their economic self-determination. This analysis is useful in figuring out ways to improve living standards outside of the imperial core Western nations. Look at China, Yugoslavia, even the UK under Clement Attlee. At different times, these countries have used the power of the state in a way to improve living standards of regular people. China mixed Western economic models with Confucian philosophy to form what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. The problem with the brand of free market capitalism the West preaches to the global South is that it entrenches existing class and economic divides, leaving those with money and connections to power controlling the economy at the expense of the majority. This is the case in most modern African countries. They still effectively have colonial economies not built to deliver for people en masse. The post-colonial state, as Mahmood argues, continues to be structured along the lines of systemic exclusion unless it dismantles the architecture it inherited from the colonial predecessor. Today, a local African elite has just replaced the European one at the expense of the many. The structural contradictions of African economies mean liberal democracy isn't capable of delivering for people en masse. Most African people today see economic freedom as even more important than political freedom, and you can't blame them with a continent that has so many poor people. Zohran's mother, Miranaya, is an acclaimed Indian-American filmmaker known for Golden Globe winning Monsoon Wedding and the 1991 romantic comedy Mississippi Masala. Starring a young Denzel Washington, by the way. This film explored the romantic relationship between a black man and an Indian woman in the south of the US. Heavy in the background and themes of this movie were racism and the relations between black and Indian people, as well as the Indian exclusion from East Africa. These influences made Zohran's upbringing a roaming education in diasporic intellectualism, where ideas about justice, decolonization, and identity were probably household conversations. Viewing Zohran through the lens of his parents' work, we can better understand his politics and why he identifies as a democratic socialist. This explains his campaign focus on free childcare, rent freezes, taxing the rich, government-run grocery stores. These issues are targeted at tackling economic injustice in New York. He focuses on basic bread and butter issues as opposed to complicated, means-tested liberal policies that the Democratic Party has become accustomed to. That's why he won, and that's why people believe his policies are doable. But like many leftists before him, liberals and the right wing, but mostly liberals, will do whatever they can to undermine his policies and ensure they fail so they can say, hey look, socialism never works. People in Latin America, Asia and Africa have long had to contend with this from the US empire. In America, Eugene Debs, Bernie Sanders more recently, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, people like that are constantly undermined by liberals in ways conservatives are just not. The left is seen as a more legitimate threat because true leftists want to challenge the economic and political order that the US empire is currently benefiting from. Many leaders like Thomas Sankara, even Ibrahim Traore today, and Zohran's namesake Kwame Nkrumah believe political freedom is nothing without economic justice. Uganda after independence and post-apartheid South Africa are great examples of this. The power of the state should be used to improve the lives of the people who live there, not corporate interest. Zohran is not just pro-Palestine because he's a Muslim. Zohran is pro-Palestine because of his understanding of the history of imperialism in Africa and its legacy on the continent. The African struggle for self-determination in the 60s is linked to the plight of the Palestinians today. Israeli settler colonialism is very familiar to what was historically practiced in both Uganda and South Africa, and this is at odds with the leftist post-colonial ideas of Zohran Mamdani. The self-determination of colonized people is core to his worldview. This perspective surely shapes his view of the global south, and this will give you clues about his political positions, especially on foreign policy. So remember when you see Zohran Mamdani pushing socialist policies in New York, remember this isn't just influenced by American politics. British colonialism created a racial hierarchies and economic apartheid that placed Indians as a colonial middleman at Africans' expense in East Africa. Ultimately, Indians were also a victim of this structure despite their petty privileges in the country. Predictably, there were no consequences for the British who created this structure and benefited the most from it. Although the Indian exclusion happened long before Zohran was born, it shaped his politics for sure. The African independent movement has given us a valuable lesson. Political liberation is possible but incomplete without economic justice. This is a lesson Mahmood Mamdani has learned firsthand as a young man, witnessing Uganda's birth. Idi Amin's expulsion, however brutal and misguided, revealed the contradictions of a post-colonial society where political freedoms couldn't address the structural economic inequalities created by colonialism. Three forces, colonial exploitation, the African liberation struggle, and the limits of political freedom, didn't just shape one family story. They created a worldview of what is now America's most radical politician. The weird thing is, Zohran is not even that radical. Zohran's democratic socialism isn't just an import from European theory. It's a product of a lived experience with colonialism, displacement, and the ongoing struggle for economic justice that his father's generation fought across 3 continents. Zohran's family story and his father's politics have clearly influenced him, and you suspect that was intentional. It's not a coincidence that Zohran's middle name is Kwame. He's named after Kwame Nkrumah, one of the major Pan-Africanist voices, or that he quotes Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King quite regularly. These politics are a part of his identity, and viewing it through this lens gives us useful understanding going forward. I mean, this guy has a degree in Africana Studies from a top US university. He is actually taking time to understand the intellectual framework behind his politics and the politics of many great men. The question isn't whether Zohran's policies will work in America. The question is really whether America is ready for a politics forged in the anti-colonial struggle. A politics that sees through the empire's lies because it had lived them and understands what real freedom requires. These are lessons the Mamdani family learned because of their interaction with the British Empire. Lessons learned in the highlands of Uganda might just be what American socialism needs to finally challenge the empire from within. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll catch you on the next one. This is A Hail Pale Tale. Peace.